Hi, I'm Richard from Trails of the City, Footprints of London and Other Places, History Tour Guide, and welcome to the second instalment of Trails Live History Cast. For those of you who didn't stall in last week, because of this terribly difficult period of the coronavirus pandemic lockdown, I'm clearly unable to go out and actually do any guiding. So what I've decided to do is to take it online and do some presentations from my own living room, and each Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock present a different London historic character who I have featured on my walks over the years. And today the character is David Porter. David who, you might be saying? Well, this is a terrific story of from rags to riches, someone who climbed up, as it were, from one of the most infamous and terrible child exploitation trades to become a great property magnate and respected vestryman and rich businessman and London gent. And I came across Porter when researching my walk, London's Ragged and Reformers, about Victorian social conditions in Marylebone. And I walked down a street just off the north end of Baker Street called Porter Street with a David Mews, a little cul-de-sac going to the side of that. And I had a little bit of a hunch about the name, so went away and started to research and unearthed this amazing life. David Porter was born in 1747 in Peterborough. He was employed by his father as a chimney sweep from the age of 10 to 19. Both his father and his grandfather had worked in exactly the same trade. At the age of 21 only, his father died, and he decided to set himself up as a master sweep with a number of junior infant sweeps underneath him. And one gets the impression that for the first few years, he really struggled and was subsisting through hard times, trying to tout his business in and around houses in Peterborough. Until in the early 1770s, having married, he decides to up sticks and move to London and settles in Marylebone to try for any better luck there. And he certainly must have been self-educated, David, but he must have been very hard-working and certainly pretty entrepreneurial, because after just a few years, if you'll forgive the pun, he starts to sweep up large swathes of the business in Marylebone and West London. He develops a little bit of a sideline, selling bags of the soot to market gardeners in the countryside around London there. A lady Montague who lives close by in a townhouse on Portman Square helps him, and she's also very kindly to all of the local chimney sweeps, in particular laying on a May Day supper of roast beef followed by plum pudding and singing and dancing, and then sending away all the little boys 1 shilling richer. In fact, the local sweeps May Day parade was quite a tradition through the 18th and 19th centuries. They would march through the London streets carrying an effigy of the Jack in the Green or the Green Man, bashing their dusters and their baskets and so on, with two of them dressed up as Lord and Lady Sweep. Porter carries around a business card which touts himself as David Porter, chimney sweep to Her Royal Highness Amelia, who was the sister to George III. He's doing so well, in fact, that by the turn of the 19th century, he decides to devote the profits he's earned from chimney sweeping into buying up many plots of leases in the west part of Marylebone, which are ripe for redevelopment. And hiring the services of a local architect named Joseph Parkinson, starts to lay out and build up the streets and squares around there, including Bryanston Square, Montague Square, which is named in honour of Lady Montague, a number of streets going up towards the Edgware Road, and, of course, Porter Street and David Mews. And He, a few years later, is elected to the local Marylebone Vestry Council and acquires a very well-to-do, prestigious new property, a corner house of a lovely terrace on Park Place, very close to the new, rather royal Regent's Park. And by the time of his death in 1819, is a very rich, respected property magnate, a vestryman and respected Londoner, and I might add, philanthropist and campaigner. Because let's step back a little bit, and I think that the trade of chimney sweeping needs to be put into a little bit of a context, because it really was one of the most notoriously abusive and exploitative child labour trades in the 18th and 19th centuries. Young boys, their working day would start as early as 3 or 4 in the morning. They had to scramble up flues no wider than about 9 to 14 inches, wearing their elbows and knees something rotten. Sometimes there are reports of the skin hanging off kneecaps in kind of white rags that really does sound appalling. All the time breathing in this most dangerous, noxious air. In fact, many would go on to contract soot wart or cancer of the scrotum. In fact, that's what his father died of. And there was a lot of business to be had. There are estimates that around the turn of the 19th century, there were about 315 chimneys to be swept in London, with about 100 master sweeps managing that business. There was this terribly exploitative system of apprenticeship where boys as young as 6 years old would be literally bought by their master sweeps, worked appallingly hard, getting through 6 or 7 chimneys in one morning and often just getting a beating for their pains, but not from David Porter, because he was a very benign master sweep. In fact, further than that, he actively campaigned to improve the conditions of chimney sweeps. And he hooked up with the merchant philanthropist Jonas Hanway in the 1770s to change the laws in Parliament to effect this. Horace Walpole was impressed by David's work and took up the campaign, as did William Wilberforce, more commonly associated with the campaign to abolish the trade in slavery. A couple of societies were set up, one for legislation to ameliorate the conditions of chimney sweeps worked in, and secondly, to produce some kind of technology to negate the need for chimney sweeps to go up chimneys at all, which something was designed towards the end of the century. But in fact, most master sweeps found it more economic to keep sending little boys up chimneys. And the first sort of gain from this campaigning was the Better Regulation for Chimney Sweeps Act 1788, which made it illegal to send any boys under the age of 8 up chimneys, with some minor clauses as well. You might think even that was pretty small beer, but that had no enforcement along with it and was widely ignored. Porter himself continued campaigning. He produced leaflets on the matter in the 1790s, and he was called to witness to a parliamentary royal investigation into the matter in 1817. But it's sad to say that a few years later, on his death, the trade was as thrivingly as exploited as ever. But fortunately, more legislation kept coming in the 1830s, 1840s. But one thing that perhaps helped to be a change maker was not a piece of legislation, but a bit of children's literature, a fantasy book by a Reverend Charles Kingsley, The Water Babies, that was published in 1863. And it must have been an eye-opener to many upper and middle-class people about the conditions of chimney sweeps. It goes into a sort of fantasy world of this character, chimney sweep, Tom, who then sinks down into a watery, fantastical world. But the early passages really set out the appalling conditions of a chimney sweep, which I will read a paragraph from. He cried when he had to climb up the dark flues, rubbing his poor knees and elbows raw, and when he and when the soot got caught in his eyes, which it did every day in the week, and when his master beat him, which he did every day in the week, and when he had not enough to eat, which happened every day in the week, and the water babies, along with a scandalous death which hit the newspapers the following year, and following legislation that really must have helped to turn the tide. But then it was 1875, a bill presented to Parliament by Lord Shaftesbury, he whom another road, great philanthropist, a much more famous one, is named after, that really basically knocked it on the head by making it illegal for anyone to employ anyone under 21 to go up chimneys without being licensed and supervised by the police. Not just fines could be the penalty for this, but good prison sentences. And so nearly 100 years after the initial piece of regulation. But what a life then was David Porter's, and he was described by Horace Walpole as a great apostle to humanity. Well, thanks very much, everyone, again for listening. I must say, I really enjoyed the feedback and responses I got from last week's broadcast. Do let me know what you think this week as well. I'm going to carry on with it. At least it gives me something to work towards every week. And next week, well, let's just say as a link that not every presentation might necessarily be about a human character. Okay, but that doesn't work without me saying that the first two presentations have perhaps been about underdogs. Anyway, thanks very much. Do keep safe, everyone. Please stay at home, protect the NHS, and save lives. Okay, bye-bye. Bye.